Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. My name is Andrew Hockhauser, and I am this year's Treasurer of Middle Temple. I am delighted to welcome all of you to this evening's LGBTQ Forum event to mark the International Day against homophobia, transphobia, and biphobia. We are very fortunate to have a talk from Professor Paul Baker, which delights in the title, Fabulosa, the Story of Polari, Britain's Secret Gay Language. Paul is a professor of English language at the University of Lancaster. He regularly gives talks and workshops about Polari. He is a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts and a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences. He has written no less than 18 books, most recently a book about this very subject, which is entitled Fabulosa, the Story of Polari. And I checked, and it is available on Amazon. Now, I am sure that the vast majority of you are far too young to remember the BBC radio comedy programme Round the Horne, that was presented by a man called Kenneth Horne. I grew up to that programme. It was a mainstream show that was originally broadcast when being gay was illegal. Nonetheless, amongst its sketches was one with this outrageously camp gay couple, Sandy and Jules, that were played respectively by Kenneth Williams and Hugh Paddick, and it was hugely popular. Sandy and Jules spoke this strange, secretive language called Polari, and that is now enjoying a revival amongst young queer people. Now, I'm not going to say anything more because I don't want to spoil the lecture, but I would just like to wish every Omi and Palomi a bona evening and hand over without more to Paul Baker. Paul, welcome to you.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for that lovely introduction. I'm gonna share my screen because I've got a sort of a little PowerPoint presentation to show everybody, and I'm also going to play a sound clip at the start as well. We tested this out earlier. Hopefully, it will still work, but if not, you can give me a shout, and we'll see how we get on. So, right, can you see that? The PowerPoint.
Yes, we can.
Okay, I'm just going back to the start. Can you see that okay?
That's perfect.
Oh, it just started to rain really heavily outside. I hope that doesn't interfere with you being able to hear my voice. Right, so as Andrew said, this is a talk adapted from a book called Fabulosa, which came out in 2019. And I'll explain who those men on the front cover are a bit later on. Goodness, it really is thundering and raining outside. I don't know if it's the same where you are, but I hope you can hear me okay. So I think I should start by saying something a bit about how I got interested in this. And it goes back to the 1990s, when BBC released tapes of the radio sketches that Andrew mentioned from the series Round the Horne, which ran from 1965 to 1968. So there's a cast photo for you. The show was called Round the Horne, and it was a reference to the show's lead, Kenneth Horne, who appears there in the middle of this cast photo. Now, for many listeners, the funniest part of the show was a sketch that usually occurred at the end with those two out-of-work actors, Julian and Sandy. And though it was never spelt out, you didn't have to be Sherlock Holmes to work out that they were both gay men. So the man with the square jaw on the left is Hugh Paddick. He played Julian. And the man standing next to him is Kenneth Williams, who played Sandy. And if you're of a certain age, my age or older, you'll probably recognize Kenneth Williams from the Carry On film series. The sketches had a very simple format. In each one, Kenneth Horne would come across Julian and Sandy, and they'd set up some new business venture, which only ever lasted 1 week. And so they'd usually invite him in, they'd make fun of his personal and physical appearance, usually for a bit. They'd engage in a bit of gossip about their friends, and then they'd argue with one another, and often they'd end with a song or a punchline. And what made these sketches so distinctive was that the characters spoke in this language, Polari. So every sketch would start with Mr. Horne knocking on the door, and Sandy would say, "Oh, hello, Mr. Horne, how bona to vada your dolly old eek again," which means how nice to see your pretty face again. So I've got a short clip to play for you. Hopefully this will work and you'll be able to hear it, although do somebody give me a shout and tell me if you can't hear it. It's only a couple of minutes.
This programme, the subject of advertising on the BBC has cropped up again. Now, in general, I think advertising is a jolly good thing. So when I was approached recently by an agency to make a TV commercial, I agreed. And the following morning, I turned up at their studio in Chelsea, and the sign on the door said, "Bona ads, commercials for the trade. Don't knock, enter." So I didn't and did. Hello, anybody there?
Oh, hello, I'm Julian and this is my friend Sandy.
Oh, hello, Mr. Horne. Oh, lovely. Oh, yes. How bona to vada your dolly old family-sized new improved eek again. What brings you trolling in here?
I've been sent up by the agency.
You don't surprise me.
What ad are you doing?
Well, it's obviously not hair cream.
Oh, I don't know. It could be for that new riah restorer. What's it called? Fuzzy top. You know, before and after.
Before and after, it looks more like instead. No, hold on. That's not Mr. Horne doing that.
Well, I should rather hope not.
Oh, no. Of course it's not him. How silly of me. It's Sir Lawrence Olivier.
You're great fool. It's Larry Oliver. Larry Oliver.
Oh,
friend of Gordon.
Oh.
Down the slipper bar.
Yes. Just for the moment, I thought we'd made the big time.
Big time, yes. Of course, we're still a struggling
So you get the
concern.
idea. They go on and on like that for about 10 minutes. You probably noticed a couple of Polari words in there. There wasn't a lot, and they never really used very much. So you may have heard trolling, which is walking, and riah, which means hair. And it's usually possible to work out what the Polari words were because there weren't very many. Only about 2% of the sketches were actually in Polari, the rest was in English. And they only used quite a small number of words, about 50 in total. But it was due to these sketches that I first got interested in Polari. I wanted to know where these words had come from, and just as importantly, where they went. I just started going out on the gay scene myself as a 22-year-old, I think, at the time. And I wasn't hearing anybody using these Polari words. So it was a bit of a mystery, and I wondered whether they'd just all been made up or whether it had been a real thing and it just died out really, really quickly. And if so, why had it gone away so quickly? And I was just starting to do some PhD research at the time with a kind of general focus on gay language. And so I thought I'd focus on Polari. I also thought it would be good to kind of give a voice to the people who used this language. There was a group that hadn't really been given any serious attention in the past. They were rarely in films or TV shows, and if they were often the villain, or they got killed off halfway through. They were never the heroes of films and TV shows. And I thought it would be good, to kind of hear their stories and get a record of their language and the way that they lived their lives before that was all lost for good. So going right the way back, some of the words we can trace to the 18th century come from language that was used by the gay and criminal subcultures of the time. So words like bitch and queen and trade have been around for quite a long time. They were used by a group of men who were called mollies, who were around in the 1720s. They were based quite close to where I am at the moment, which is the taverns in the Holborn area of London. But the mollies didn't call themselves gay. That wasn't the word that didn't come till much later. But they did engage in practices that we would, look at and say, have something in common with contemporary gay culture. So they had relationships with other men. They called each other by camp names or female names, and they sometimes dressed up in drag or female clothes. This was not a very safe time, though, to be a molly or part of a sexual minority group. there was a moral campaign against them. There was a group called the Society for the Reformation of Manners, and one of their missions was to kind of hunt these men down and prosecute them. And there was a raid at an infamous Molly house that was run by a woman called Mother Clapp in Holborn in 1725. About 40 of these men were rounded up. Most of them were put in the stocks or sent to prison, but 3 of them were actually hanged. And it was because of this kind of criminalisation of the Mollies that a lot of them ended up mixing with real criminals in prison. And so they started sort of using crossover language. Criminals used a language called cant. And we start seeing that Mollies are using some of these words from cant. So in cant, a wig is a poll, a shirt is a mish, and shoes were stampers. A bit later on, in the 19th century, we get a source of Polari, which comes from an older form of slang called Palari, which sounds a bit like Polari anyway. And this was used by groups who were kind of traveling around the UK, beggars, prostitutes, people who worked in traveling carnivals and fairgrounds, and also traveling markets as well. So Polari is a bit of a kind of halfway house between the older cant and the Molly words, and then later on what becomes Polari. And there are Polari words from numbers and money, words associated with different trades and lodgings and having a kind of traveling lifestyle. I've just put a little snippet of conversation there in Polari, and that's from 2 street performers who are kind of dividing up the day's takings. So one's saying, what's the bottle cull, which means how much have we taken? And then the other one goes up to count the money. Dewey funds, that's £2. Tré Bianc, that's 3 shillings, and so on. Now, a lot of these Polari words come from Italian, suggesting that a lot of these traveling people either had been over to Italy or they were Italian and they come over to the UK to work as entertainers, including people who worked on Punch and Judy shows. And we start to get some of the most well-known Polari words from this period, words like bona, which is good, latti, which is house, and omi, which is man. So these are kind of derived from Italian words and changed sometimes just a bit. We've also got the words for the numbers, which I've put there on the right, and you can combine these numbers to make larger ones if you want to. So 50 would be cinque decce, literally 5 tens. 700 would be settecento. 956 would be novecento cinque decce sei. Bit of a mouthful, but there we are. Now, as Polari was the language of entertainers, it started to get associated with the 19th century music halls. And people even started to incorporate Polari into bits of their acts and songs. So there's a song you may have heard of called The Daring Young Man on the Flying Trapeze. And in one of the later verses, there's a mention of someone called Signor Bona Slang. Now, as I've just noted, bona means good, but slang doesn't mean language, as you'd maybe expect it to. Slang refers to a gymnast's performance. So it's saying basically this man has a good performance. And we move on to the 20th century, and Polari is moving from these music halls and fairgrounds, beginning to be associated more and more with the theatre, and then beginning to be associated through the theatre with gay men who worked there. And you'd be most likely to hear it in the West End of London, or some of the theatres in the East End as well, especially popular backstage with the chorus boys, people who were like Julian and Sandy, who were actually based upon real people who spoke Polari backstage. It was also held, though, in lots of other towns and cities across the UK, not just in London, particularly places on the coast which were either holiday destinations or had working seaports. So you may have heard it in a pub in Liverpool called the Magic Clock, which was on the docks, and it catered for merchant seamen, and another sailors' pub called the Juniper Berry in Southampton. And also lots of gay men used to have quite a thing for sailors, probably still do, and so they would sort of go along to these merchant seamen pubs and hang out and see who they could pick up as well. So you get this kind of crossover between the seaman language and slang and Polari as well. Also, quite a lot of gay men joined up themselves and became merchant seamen in the 1950s and 60s after World War II. The photographs there show some of these men who were at parties on ships, and they're kind of carrying out little kind of makeshift entertainment performances to entertain their friends. And the two smaller pictures there, you can kind of see if you look closely, they've kind of made their own little stage curtain out of sheets which they've hung in the background. So Polari was very popular in these contexts. These men would join up to cruise ships, and then they would get jobs as waiters or cabin staff. And they had a great time. It was a way for them to see the world, and also to get away from the more oppressive atmosphere back home. And some of these men, they only spoke in Polari when they were off duty. And the younger ones, they kind of picked up Polari from the older ones, and it became a kind of tradition. However, sometimes people would use Polari more as a kind of secret code. So if you met somebody who you suspected might be gay, you might drop the odd Polari word into your conversation. And if they replied with another Polari word, then you'd know that you had something in common. But once you'd made that connection, you could have whole conversations in public without anyone understanding what you were saying. And for most of the 20th century, a lot of gay people wanted to keep their sexuality a secret, particularly in public contexts, and Polari helped them to do this. So I've got a couple of quotes here. This is the first one's from a woman called Jo Purvis. Now, she was a DJ in London, and she was interviewed about using Polari in the early 90s. And she says it was marvelous. You could use it on a tube train or a bus. You could talk about the person opposite in Polari, and no one except theatrical people would understand. Now, you did have to be a bit careful about when you use Polari. One of the men I interviewed, he told me that he and his friend had gone on holiday to Italy. They decided to buy some fashionable Italian shoes to impress their friends back home. So they'd gone to a shoe shop, and the man who was measuring their feet was a very handsome Italian guy. So they started talking about him in Polari, saying how much they fancied him and how good looking he was. And then he said thank you, because he'd understood everything that they'd said, because Polari is so similar to Italian. And everyone in the shop who was there, they all burst out laughing, so they'd understood it as well. And the poor guy was so embarrassed and humiliated, he kind of ran out of the shop. It was all very dramatic, as you can imagine. The moral of the story being that if you're going to use a secret language, it's a good idea to run a background check on its etymology and history before you start using it. But not all of the speakers of Polari wanted to be secret or hidden. And particularly towards the end of the 60s, some speakers became a bit bolder with their use of it. So the writer Peter Burton there, and he talks about how he and his friends flaunted their sexuality. So they'd dress up wearing sort of makeup and very colourful camp clothes, and they'd sort of sashay down the street. And if they got dirty looks from people, they'd sort of scream at them in Polari and insult them. And no one could understand what they were saying. So it felt a bit like being cursed in another language. And people didn't really know how to respond to that. It was very much a language of gossip and a language of sex as well. Many of the words were evaluations. So you talk about who you fancied, who was bona, who was not very fanciable, which was naff, which was sometimes claimed was an acronym, NAFF, which was supposed to stand for not available for fucking. But I think actually it probably meant something that came from a different etymology than that. But people would say, oh, don't bother with him, he's naff. And gradually people would hear the word naff, they'd realise that guess it meant something bad, and then straight people would start using it themselves, not realising that they were the original naffs. There were lots of words for body parts as well. It was a very kind of physical language, and I've got a kind of visual kind of illustration of kind of aide-memoire to kind of show you some of the body parts. And I'm using a well-known footballer to help me do this. So here we are, and apologies to Ronaldo. But we'll start at the top and we'll work our way down to the bottom with him. So we can see, first of all, we've got the word riah, which is hair. And this is a back slang word. It's hair pronounced backwards. There are quite a few of these words in Polari. Another one was esong, which is nose backwards. And then ecaf is face backwards. Ecaf sometimes got shortened to eek. So that's where you get the phrase bona to vada or dolly old eek from. It's actually from ecaf. There's also a bit of Cockney rhyming slang in Polari because it came from London, and particularly there were links to the East End of London from the music halls and the docks there as well. So plates were feet, as in the Cockney rhyming slang for plates of meat. Plates, though, could also sometimes be used to refer to oral sex. So you could say, you know, he gives good plates, or he plated me. So you had to be a bit careful when you used plates, because it could have two meanings. Eyes were orbs. They could also be minces, though. That's from the Cockney rhyming slang for mince pies. And they could be ogles as well. Your ears were Polari lobes, and your mouth was a mooey. Sometimes a mouth was called a screech. And if you wanted someone to stop talking, you'd say, oh, shut your screech. Sometimes a mouth was referred to as an oyster. And if you wanted to make someone to make you smile, you'd say, turn my oyster up. Muscles, particularly ones on the arms, were referred to as thews, while things were luppers, and your marts were hands. Sometimes marts were lengthened to martinis, and some Polari speakers took this even further. So your right hand was a sweet martini and your left hand was a dry martini. And then we've got a couple of words for more taboo body parts. So we've got dish, which was bum or anus, and carts, and where your kind of swimsuit region at the front. An STD was referred to as a catava cartzo, literally meaning bad genitals. And then your legs were lallies, which was a very well-known Polari word. You know, you'd say something like, ooh, bona lallies he has. There were also lots of words for different types of people, and particularly one set of people who were seen as the natural enemies of Polari speakers. I'll show you who they are on this slide. Lots of words then for the police. Betty Bracelet's orderly daughters, Jennifer Justice, Beryl with a brooch, Lily Law, etc. I think the most common one from the people I've spoken to was probably Lily Law. Sometimes they were just called Lily. And you could make a whole room scatter. If you were in a particular cinema, there was one called, I think its nickname was the Biograph, but its actual name was the Biograph, over in Victoria, which was well known for cruising. And all someone had to do would scream Lily, and everyone would kind of run for the exit straight away. And a police station was called a lily pad. Now, as you can see here, there's a lot of alliteration going on, a lot of repetition of that first consonant sound, and with a lot of slang, Polari speakers used alliteration and rhyming to create more memorably amusing terms. These are also quite feminizing words as well, and Polari speakers did this a lot. They switched around gender, so they referred to each other with female pronouns. They called themselves queens, and that wasn't meant as an insult. And they had quite a complicated kind of categorization system of different types of queens. Some who you probably know yourself. So things like drag queen, which is still around from shows like RuPaul's Drag Race. Cottage queen was a guy who hung around public loos for sex. They were called cottagers back then. Blase queen was a kind of queen who was a bit above herself. She thought she was something special, maybe. Black market queen was a man who was, you know, to all intents and purposes straight, but then you discover actually later on that he was gay. Sometimes they were called phantoms, and particularly on the cruise ships, there was always a phantom who'd go around at night and kind of sort of administer oral sex to people in their bunks when they were sleeping. And he was sometimes affectionately called the Phantom Gobbler. I'm not sure whether you know, you could get away with anything like that these days, but it was a very different time. And then Blob Queen is a one which probably most of you haven't heard of. A Blob Queen was a kind of a bit of a sort of boring, kind of dumpy figure who'd often kind of attach themselves maybe to a drag queen or a more glamorous queen, hoping that some of the glitter would kind of rub off on them. And we've also got other words relating to gender in Polari. So I mentioned earlier, a man was an omi in Polari, a woman was a palone, and a gay man was an omi palone, and a lesbian was a palone omi. So this was not a very politically correct time. It wasn't the politically correct language. I think the speakers had quite complicated relationships with women. They idolized female movie stars. Often they kind of named themselves after female stars, and they wanted to copy them and look like them. They had close friendships with women as well, but they often viewed women as competition for the very butch, kind of straight-acting men that they fancied. And I think had a lot of these Polari speakers been around now, they would have maybe identified with terms like genderqueer or non-binary, but those weren't words that existed, so they had to make do with only palone. They christened each other with female names as well, and this was a big part about being initiated into the kind of Polari-speaking subculture. You had to be given a name by your friends, and you didn't get really to pick it yourself. And there were sometimes quite glamorous names like Diamond Lil. If you wore a lot of black, you might be called the Black Widow, for example. If you were from Scotland, you might be called Scotch Flo. So the names kind of picked up on some aspect of your physical appearance or your personality or where you were from. Polari could be used for social bonding, but there was also a bit of an edge to it. It was a bit of a kind of a bitchy language, I think, of some of the speakers. Could be used for one-upmanship, and I think anyone who was maybe a bit precious, a bit of a blasé queen, might be christened with a bit of a dowdy name like Gladys or Mavis, just to kind of take them down a peg or two. So it's important to note there's an attitude that comes with Polari. You don't just learn the words, but you learn a kind of way of looking at the world. And I think that was really important for the time. It was quite a defensive form of language where attack was actually seen as the best form of defense. And you had to have the funniest line and say it before anybody else could insult you back first. So there's quite a strong element of gallows humour, I think, to Polari, or black humour. It was used to laugh in the face of the police, the newspapers, the medical profession, and also the law. All of them whom were saying that to be gay at the time was wrong, was criminal, and was a kind of disease or a sickness. So I think this attitude and Polari through it helped people to cope with that, to kind of laugh at it. It was a pretty horrible time, I think, the 50s to be gay. You could be convicted just for holding hands with somebody in the street, for smiling or winking at somebody. If you went out, if you were a man and you wore maybe a bit of blusher or eyeshadow, that would be enough to get you arrested and taken off. Bars would regularly get raided with everybody arrested and kind of wheeled off as well. And people were often blackmailed for being gay too. And you could get put in prison, you could be fined, you could lose your job. And there was quite a bit of public shaming as well, with people's names being published in newspapers for these terrible crimes. There were 2,437 convictions for homosexuality just in 1 year, 1963 alone. And I've put a couple of pages there from newspapers from the 50s and 60s. So the first one's from 1952, and that's from a newspaper called Sunday Pictorial. And it's referring to gay men as evil men and asking, is prison the proper place for them? And it suggests that they should be sent to clinics instead to be cured. The second one is from 1963, that's from the Sunday Mirror, how to spot a possible homo. And there's various categories there, like the over-clean man, the middle-aged man who has an unnaturally strong affection for his mother, and things like that. And this kind of homophobia, just when it kind of went on, it didn't stop with decriminalisation in 1967. It kind of went on through the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and so on. One of the men that I interviewed told me about one of his friends who was a Polari speaker in the 1980s, and they were living in Croydon at the time, and they'd arranged to meet at a pub called the Bird in Hand. The friend there was very late, and everyone was getting quite rowdy about him. And when he did arrive, he was about an hour late or two, like 2 hours late, I think. And he kind of breezed in like nothing was wrong, and announced in a very flamboyant way, "Your mother's been arrested, Ducky." And he'd been picked up by the police earlier that evening in a cruising area. And while this was quite a traumatic event, he'd kind of made light of it. He made a joke of it. And he'd used this kind of camp language referring to himself as your mother, which is something that Polari speakers often did. They talked about themselves in third person. So one of the key aspects about Polari was to kind of make other people laugh, and also to be able to laugh at your own circumstances as well, to just make fun of things because it showed you weren't bothered, that they couldn't get you down. And this was very much a viewpoint which was present in the radio comedy show Round the Horne. And in the 1960s, Julian and Sandy entertained family audiences with cheerfully camp personas. And I think from today's perspective, we could view them as quite silly stereotypes, but for the time, I think they were quite groundbreaking. They didn't care, literally. There were two men who were not criminals. didn't die at the end of the episode. And I don't think they would have cared whether we thought they were stereotypes or not. They would have had a much wittier retort, I think, to put us in our place if we said anything mean about them. Now, Kenneth Williams and Hugh Paddick, who played Julian and Sandy, were gay themselves, and their use of Polari was authentic. I got these, I was very lucky to get these from the British Library, and these are excerpts from Kenneth Williams' actual diaries that got published a bit later on, but these are actually, you can see his very neat handwriting there. And I've just put in those little squares, those rectangles actually, some of the cases where he's actually using Polari in his diary. So towards the bottom of the first page, he says he had a very camp evening, but he only met tatty types, so he didn't bother to make overtures. And on the second page, he says he's gone to the Matelot's bar. I think he's in Hong Kong in 1947. So he's met a couple of sailors or marines there, met two marines, very charming, bona shamshis, he says. So bona means good, and shamshis are teeth. Now there are quite rude jokes in the Round the Horne sketches, if you know where to look. And I wondered how the writers got away with this, especially as there was a kind of notorious morals campaigner called Mary Whitehouse around that time, who was always trying to get things banned. And just before he died, I interviewed Barry Tuck, who was one of the writers of the scripts of Round the Horne, and you know, I asked him about the Polari and about Kenneth Williams and Hugh Paddick. He told me that Paddick and Williams knew a lot more Polari than he did. So, for example, there was one phrase that Kenneth Williams uses in about 3 sketches, and it's "Order allow your lepers on the Striller's bona," which it's quite an innocent phrase. Actually, it just means come and play something nice for us on the piano. Literally, come lay your fingers on the piano well, would be the kind of word for word gloss of that. Barry Tuck told me that everyone involved in the program was kind of too embarrassed to admit that they didn't understand what it meant. So they just let Kenneth Williams keep it in, even though it wasn't really part of the script. And for me, that the amount of power that gives Kenneth Williams is really fascinating. Now, bear in mind that this is a show that was a family-oriented show. It went out on Sunday afternoons, so you'd have your Sunday lunch with your family, then you'd turn on the radio, you'd listen to Round the Horne together as a family. And it's amazing that they got away with so much. So here's a bit of a ruder example of the sort of thing they did get away with. So in one of the sketches called Rent a Chap, Julian and Sandy are employed as cleaners, and Mr. Horne says to them, "Here's the dishcloths, go in the kitchen and just get on with it." And Julian replies, "Oh, we can't wash up in here, all the dishes are dirty." And then at that point, Sandy, played by Kenneth Williams, says, "Speak for yourself." Now that line, "speak for yourself," isn't in the published version of the script. So it's likely that Kenneth Williams ad-libbed it. He just added it in on the sly. And it gets an extra laugh if you listen to the actual script of Rent a Chap. The audience probably think that Sandy is talking about himself as a dish or a dishy man. But if you refer back to the Cristiano Ronaldo slide I had, dish means bum or anus. So Sandy's "speak for yourself" line has a much ruder kind of third meaning there, if you were a Polari speaker and knew the true meaning of dish. There's a song which was popularised by a drag entertainer called Lee Sutton, who was a big deal in the 1970s in London. And he actually had a whole song in Polari called Bona Eek, which was to the tune of Babyface. And in one of his lines, he says, "I'd grant your every wish, I'd even grease my dish, just to see your Bona Eek." So you get the idea of how Polari speakers were using dish when they could. Now, when I explained this rude meaning of dish to Barry Tuck, the scriptwriter, he was pretty horrified. He had no idea that that's what dish meant in Polari. And I think that also helps to explain why Julian and Sandy escaped from the kind of the eagle eyes of Mary Whitehouse. She did complain about some of the other sketches in Round the Horne, but she left Julian and Sandy well alone. And I think it was partly because of their Polari, it let them be more outrageous than maybe she was realizing. So Julian and Sandy, I think, brought Polari to a younger generation of people and kind of gave it a bit of a second lease of life. I think by the late 60s, it was already being seen as becoming maybe a bit sort of old-fashioned, a bit naff itself. And times were changing, I think, as well. as well as introducing it to younger people, Julian and Sandy also maybe spoil the secret of Polari a little bit. So, what's the point of using it if everybody now knows what Polari is and some of the basics? It was incredibly popular. It had 9 million listeners a week. In 1967, it won the award for the best radio comedy show. And in the same year, homosexuality was decriminalized. And things didn't change overnight. And in fact, in some cases, they actually got quite a bit worse with more arrests. But it did mean, for the first time, gay people could start to organize, they could campaign, they could meet, they could get political in a way that was, not really as feasible beforehand. And this started to change things. It started to change attitudes as well to homosexuality, to camp. So we have a movement called gay liberation, which is kind of coming up in the early 70s, a very young movement linked to university campuses, taking inspiration from women's liberation and Black power. This picture is from Sussex Gay Liberation Front in Brighton. And you can look at some of their signs there: gay but not ashamed, no more sex roles. So these are activists who don't want to be hiding. They don't want to stay in the closet and use a secret language. They want the opposite. They want people to know that they're gay. And some of them were quite critical of the camp representations around gay men of the time, viewing them as stereotyping and mocking of women as well. Some of you may be old enough to remember a show, a sitcom called Are You Being Served, which had a character called Mr. Humphreys, who was very, very kind of camp in that. And people boycotted that character, and they demonstrated outside theatres when he showed up. There was a whole kind of backlash against camp at the time, which I think from today's perspective maybe seems a little bit quaint and a bit earnest, but at the time there weren't very many representations of gay people, and the few that they were had to do a lot of work for everybody, and so they were seen as a bit over the top, and people wanted more representation. So where did this leave Polari? Well, it was seen as really something that wasn't going to help the liberationist cause. And we start seeing articles in gay magazines of the early 70s, which are kind of raising questions about camp language and Polari in particular. So there's a gay magazine called Lunch, which ironically was used as a Polari word to refer to someone's genitals. And we've got an article by Mary McIntosh, an author of the time, and she says, camp is a form of minstrelization. Polari is a product of a culture which, while it's deeply ambivalent, and although it celebrates effeminacy and obviousness and casual promiscuous sexuality, can never really accept that these things are good. The terms of address are used in a negative, mocking way. And then another article in Lunch, a bit later, a writer called Jonathan Raban goes even a bit further. He says that a language like Polari is really just a language of body parts and fucking. And he says, isn't it time for everyone to tidy their toys away and to take a few of the bricks out of the walls of the ghetto? In 1982, Princess Anne was reported in newspapers as telling photographers to naff off when she fell off her horse during the badminton horse trials. And perhaps by now there's a sense that Polari has really pretty much run its course. If actual members of royalty are using Polari terms like naff, then where does that leave the original queens? Polari is clearly no longer a secret language. It's no longer a kind of special thing. And it's becoming increasingly associated by this time with old men. So I mentioned that phrase black market queen earlier, a BMQ, which is referring to gay men who keep their sexuality secret. Now, black market queen comes from World War II slang, and it may have been okay to use it in the 1940s, but if you're still using it in the 1980s, it's dating you, it's showing how old you are. And if there's one thing about gay subculture that hasn't changed, it's that focus on youth driving things, and it not being cool to be old, which I think is a bit of a shame, and that's one of the things that happens. And in any case, there's a new model in the 1970s in how to be gay, which is coming from America, in places like New York and San Francisco. And this is a look and a way of behaving which is not about being camp and being funny, but it's about being butch, super butch, in fact, about leather, denim, tight clothes, muscles, big mustaches, working out. These men were referred to as clones because they all looked very similar to one another. And many of the older Polari speakers in particular absolutely hated them, particularly because they were in competition for the kind of men that they wanted. British men who went on holiday to the US in the 70s were very attracted to this clone look, and they took it back with them when they came back to the UK. And since the 70s, it's really been America, I think, more and more that we've kind of looked to in the UK for our language, not just gay people, but you know, people generally. In the past, in the Julian and Sandy sketches, there was a word that was used to refer to gay people, and it was bold. So Julian and Sandy would say, "Oh, isn't he bold?" And it kind of meant a sort of mixture of shamelessness and flamboyancy and bravado, I think, really. And really, to be gay in the 50s, you had to be pretty bold. But we don't really talk about being bold anymore. There are other words that we hear now, like fierce and sassy, which come from the drag culture in the US. So you may hear them on shows like RuPaul's Drag Race. We don't hear bold. We don't talk about black market queens anymore. That's not a term that I'd ever heard being used, even when I was coming out in the 90s. But I was aware of a closet queen. And closet is a particularly American word. I don't know about you, unless you've got a really big house. In my house, I've got a wardrobe. I don't have a closet. But we don't talk about wardrobe queens. In Polari, a young gay man was a chicken, and that was a word which you probably hear up until about the early 90s. It was a word that was used on me a few times when I first started going to gay bars. It went out of fashion in about 1993, 94, I think, and it's more recently been replaced by an American term, twink. In the sort of towards the end of the last century, there was a debate about Polari in a gay free magazine called Boys, which I used to work for. I'm ashamed to admit, for one summer until they sacked me. They had this debate about Polari, which went over 3 issues of their letters pages. So it starts with somebody writing in to say, why is it about time we get rid of these words like lallies and trade and bona? They're not useful or relevant. They don't reflect the queer society we live in, and they're just an embarrassment. And then the next week, other people wrote up to kind of defend Polari. One person says, "Oh, lighten up, mate. It's all just fun." Another person says, "Polari is part of gay heritage, and why should we turn our back on that? We should really respect it and remember those people." The third week, though, somebody wrote in to say, the 2 guys who'd written in to keep Polari, they'd given their addresses as living in quite remote parts of the UK. So he described as living in the sticks, implying that only fashionable people wanted to keep Polari. And then the editor of Boys contributed to the debate, calling Polari evil. And he wrote, "Spout your Polari all you like, but live somewhere far away from us, like 1954. So by this point, Polari really is on the way to being seen as naff. It's silly, it's old-fashioned, and it's increasingly irrelevant. But there were signs, though, that there was a kind of counter kind of backlash to the backlash, and things were about to change again. And this is the exact moment that happens. It's a picture taken in 1991, and it's the reason why I included it as the book cover for the book I wrote on Polari. So it's taken from a religious ceremony, believe it or not. The guy wearing the crown on the left is the filmmaker Derek Jarman, and he's been canonized, made into a saint, by members of a group called the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence, who are a group of gay men who dress as nuns. They were a worldwide activist organization, and in the UK they've carried out blessings and partnership ceremonies for LGBT people long before you could get married. And they've also made notable people into saints for their activism and for their good works. And in their ceremonies, they decided to use Polari to kind of revive it. They viewed it as a dead language, a bit like Latin is to Catholics. And they felt that if they used it in their ceremonies, it would make their ceremonies sound a bit more exotic. So they refer to their use of Polari as high Polari. And I've put a couple of quotes there from their ceremony. So they say, "Sissies and omies and palones of the gathered faithful, we're now getting to the kernel, the nub, the very thrust of why we're gathered here today at Derek's bona bijou latte, of Derek's nice little house." Now, Derek Jarman said that his canonization was one of the happiest moments of his life. He died of an AIDS-related illness just a couple of years later. And for those of you who were around in the 80s and 90s, you probably remember the British media, the newspapers, particularly the tabloids, were not very nice to the gay community. So the sisters used Polari in a similar way to how it had been used in the 50s. They used it to be defiantly gay and to be funny. But they took this a bit further and they showed that camp could be political. It wasn't just silly and irrelevant, but it could be used for a political message. And gradually, as the 90s went on, Polari started to be reevaluated. It started to be seen as something that was part of queer heritage, and then something as academic interest to social historians and to linguists like me. And gradually, as people rediscovered Polari, it then began to be something which could be commodified and used to brand gay businesses. One of my kind of hobbies is to go around collecting photographs of different businesses that have used Polari in their names. So we've got the name of a cafe in Brighton called Bona Foodie, which is actually why that was the street where I started doing my research back in the 90s in Kemp Town. We've also got in the Isle of Wight a clothes shop called Bona Togs. In Dublin, there's a pub there called the George, and I don't know if you can see that, but it's just off to the side of the words the George, there's the words Bona Polari, which is obviously advertising what you get if you go there. A good chat or good talk. And even somewhere as unglamorous as Stoke-on-Trent, we've got a cafe called the Polari Lounge, which actually received council funding and was part of their cultural quarter. I discovered that by accident during a visit to Stoke. And I was really kind of excited about it. I went in and they had all these leaflets on the table explaining what Polari was, and they even quoted my research. And I got really kind of stoked and really excited. And I kind of rushed up to the counter and I said to the guy serving, "That's me. I'm the guy who researched Polari." And I think he just thought I was crazy and making it up, because he told me to sit down quite sternly, and he'd bring the drinks over when they were ready, and that was as far as it got. I did get some better responses from other places though. There's a place in London closer to where I am called Madame Jojo's, which is I think reopening. Now they got a public relations firm to contact me in 2004. They wanted their staff to start using Polari with their customers as a way of giving the place a more kind of authentic feel. Trouble was they didn't know any Polari. So they asked me to kind of create some training materials for them with words and phrases that staff could use when they were serving their customers. And I was happy to do so. And the story got publicised in the national press. So there's a little article there about that story from 2005 on the BBC News website. And that was the whole point of this. It was to get Madame Jojo's into the news as a way of getting publicity for it, so that people would then turn up. And obviously they would, make more money and be successful. And we've got other examples of that. This is 2013 from Metro newspaper, the Trend Watch column. And there's a restaurant in trendy Shoreditch, which has Polari themed cocktails like the riah shisha, the hairdresser, and the bijou basket, which I'll let you translate that one yourself. Even more recently, there's a clothing company called Polari, which sells quite expensive hoodies and other items of clothing. And they've used Louis Tomlinson from One Direction in its modelling campaign. And there he is looking very, very bona in his Polari hoodie. And you can look very closely and see the little trademark sign above the word Polari. Polari has been the name of an upmarket online gay magazine. It's the name of a literary salon run by Paul Burston, and it's even the name of a literary journal. There have been art exhibitions that have incorporated Polari, as well as a range of poems, pop songs, short films, and books published on it. So you only have to Google Polari and you get all of this kind of recent information, all this recent kind of cultural evidence of people still using it, but in very different ways from the way it was used back in the 50s, when it was the province of working class camp gay men. You just used it for a bit of a laugh. And now it's much more of interest to academics, artists, novelists, poets, filmmakers, and business owners. It's come a long way, I think, from its working class origins. And so one question I would ask is, has it become, so gentrified that it's now completely respectable? In 2017, so not so long ago, to mark LGBT History Month, a group of student priests at Westcott House in Cambridge used a version of the Evensong that had been translated into Polari. And they used it in their college chapel in an actual bona fide church service with members of the public present. It contains lines like, "Babeness be to the auntie, and to the homey chavvy, and to the fantabulosa fairy, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be. World and anti-end, laloo." They actually sent me a kind of recording of this, and it sounds just lovely. It sounds really, really beautiful. And if you didn't know it was in Polari, you'd think it was in Latin or something. It sounds very nice. Not everybody thinks, though, that it sounded nice. There were complaints afterwards, and then a bit of a media storm, with national newspapers reporting how the service had caused some members of the college considerable upset. And the college principal then had to issue a public apology. There was actually a bit of an investigation into it afterwards, I found out later, and the people involved had to promise that they would never do anything like that again. On social media, there were a variety of responses. Some people found the whole thing hilarious. Some people just couldn't see what the fuss was all about. And some people were actually genuinely quite angry that Polari had been used in this religious way. And not all of those people were kind of heterosexual. When I was looking at my own Twitter feed, there were some people who identified as queer who were actually quite offended by this use of Polari. For me, what's most interesting about it, though, is it shows that even now, after all this time, Polari can cause controversy. It can still make people laugh. It can still make people quite upset, though. And I think that's what it always has done. And it indicates that while there have been these huge advances since 1967, in terms of equal rights for gay people, there are still places where Polari can reveal tensions in society. And I suspect its story is not yet over. I don't think it's ever going to have a full revival. And I wouldn't want it to, really. I don't really think we need those oppressive circumstances which made it flourish to come back. And I think that may be the only way to get it to come back fully. But I do think it's important to remember the role that it played and what it was. And I think it's a testament to the creativity, the humour, and the tenacity of the people who spoke at it at the time in the 50s and the 60s. They found a way of dealing with their situation by changing their language. And that let them stay true to who they were. Every time they went out, every time they went to a bar or kissed somebody of the same sex, they broke the law. But they didn't go away. They didn't do what they were told to do. And they became, I think, there were so many of them, it became very difficult for the government to just ignore them. And I think indirectly they contributed towards the decriminalisation of homosexuality. They weren't political, they didn't go on marches and wave placards, but they were just existing. And I think in existing, that was a kind of political act in itself for the time. And I think, queer people of today have a bit of a debt to the people who were around in the 50s and 60s, the ordinary people who used things like Polari to just get by. And I think it's important to remember that and acknowledge it, even if we still think Polari is silly in camp and we wouldn't want to use it ourselves. I think there's still something to be said for thanking those people, for not giving up and for giving in. And I think also maybe it's worth thinking about the way that Polari speakers used humour in camp and how they use Polari words to deal with bad situations. And I think, in some situations that can still be quite empowering. We can all have a bad day, and if a bit of Polari or a bit of camp helps us to get through that and just have a bit of a laugh of something, why not do that? So I think that brings us up to date. I've not been able to cover everything. If you've got questions, I'm going to try and answer them. I'm finished. But if you do want to know much more, there is the book there, Fabulosa, which has a kind of glossary, a dictionary at the end if you want to learn it properly. There's also a companion website I made, which has additional words and phrases. It's got a few games and there's some maps of where Polari was spoken in London and various links to video clips and interviews of other people using it, including a few old drag acts with Polari songs in as well. But I think that's the end of my talk. So I'm kind of happy to take questions if you'd sent any. And thanks ever so much for coming along today and for listening. I really enjoyed sharing this with you. So thank you.
Well, Paul, thank you so much for that talk. It was fascinating, informative, and funny in equal parts. I'm not quite certain how Ronaldo would react to being used as a mannequin for Polari slang. That said, you've got to vada his bona lallies. I've got a couple of questions, but before I turn to them, there's just Alan Robertshaw pointed out that there's a Doctor Who episode from the 1970s called Carnival of the Monsters, where one of the characters speaks Polari. Were you aware of that?
I was, in fact. I actually have it as a slide, and I'll show you the picture of it. Actually, my talk's always too long, so I always end up kind of deleting a few of the slides, but I'm going to share my screen again, and I'll show it just for those of you who don't believe. How do I share screen? Where's that gone? Here it is. Okay, so let's get that back. And I don't know, can you see that?
Yeah.
And so there's John Pertwee, the third Doctor. I'm actually watching all the Doctor Who's at the moment, and I'm watching all the Pertwees. I'm a bit of a fan. And yes, this is the episode from Carnival of Monsters, where they speak this. I think they call it Tellurian Carnival lingo or something. And they're kind of the Doctor tries to speak Polari to these two aliens, but they don't understand him, I think, or the other way around. I forget which. But yes, it's in there, and it's a bit of an in joke, I think, for people who were entertainers. A really nice use of Polari, and just on that screen there, we've got some other uses of Polari as well. So that's Hugh Paddick, who played Julian, and he's playing Robin Hood in a Frankie Howard film from the 70s, and he speaks Polari as well. And then I've got a few, the film Love is the Devil, which is about Francis Bacon. That's actually Daniel Craig, James Bond on the front, who played his boyfriend. And there's a very short bit of Polari in there. In another film, Velvet Goldmine, there's a little scene with a couple of people speaking Polari, and they have subtitles. And then a couple of books as well, where people use Polari too. So yeah, it is finding its way into popular culture, little snippets of it in different ways. But yes, I'm glad I'm not the only person who knows Doctor Who that well.
The other thing came from Lawrence Gormley, who suggested bona fide, bona law, and bona contention.
Lovely, yes. Yes, nice example.
One very serious question, actually. If I can get the chat up, just 1 minute.
Yeah.
Hang on. One sec. It's from somebody who worked for an AIDS charity back in the late 1990s. And the point that Marion James makes is that I think the impact of HIV and AIDS seriously affected the use of the language, that as gay men were dealing with life-threatening situations that were not an appropriate use of this. What are your thoughts on that?
I see what you're saying. Yeah, I mean, I think that it depends on the individual, and I know I have heard of some gay men with HIV who then went on to die of AIDS, who actually organised incredibly camp funerals for themselves and did try to incorporate camp right up until the end and afterwards in their lives. But that obviously isn't the case for everybody. And also, I think some of the Polari speakers, when their lives were cut short hideously, far too soon. And so there's that kind of generational transmission, which would have been kind of stymied a little bit in the 80s and 90s as a result, very tragically as well. So yeah, I think that's a really fair point that Marion has to make.
Another comes from a friend of mine, Chris Rogers, who was a barrister and became a priest. And he says, I was at Westcott House when that evensong happened, and it was organised by a friend. I remember the main argument against it seemed to be that Polari isn't really a language, but slang. And I thought most interesting that it can't by its nature, therefore be reverent. What do you think
because
about
it's not a language?
Yeah.
That's a good question. Yeah, I mean, the whole debate about whether it's a language or whether it's a slang, I still don't feel it's been fully resolved. it depends who speaks it, I think. And some of the people who I interviewed and have heard speak it spoke it in a way which was pretty incomprehensible. And when you look at it, it's fulfilling most of the criteria for a language that linguists would say. So it had its own vocabulary. It had a grammar that was different to English. It wasn't just a case of inserting the odd word here or there, but you couldn't just translate it word for word. They were doing something interesting with the grammar. But a lot of people did use it in a way which was just slang, and you could probably, even if you didn't know it, you could probably pick up most of the words from context. I think I'm not sure whether you can call it language or slang or something in between. It's a hard one.
I mean, he continues by saying, isn't it always going to be a bit of parody in that kind of setting, even if it sounds beautiful? I mean, for example, calling God the Duchess, isn't that calculated to cause offence?
I'm not sure whether they meant it as offensive. And I think considering the speakers, that the original Polari speakers used phrases like Duchess, and they call each other queens, and they weren't doing it to be insulting. For them, the Queen, was the best woman there was, and that's what they wanted to be. That's what they modeled themselves on. They were queens. They were working class men, but they identified in their heads as these either glamorous Hollywood stars or actual royalty. And a lot of their kind of metaphors were, around royalty and Hollywood glamour as well. So you can use it for parody, but I think there's something, it's complicated. There's more going on, I think, than just parody with it. I think that there's also homage and love.
Simon Rowbottom asked, was this limited to men? I mean, did women use Polari, and did they use gender reversal in the way that men did?
They did. Women did use it, and one of the earlier slides had Jo Purvis, a gay woman who knew it really well and used it. I don't think women used it as much as men, and I think the women who did use it tended to have part of friendship groups that had a lot of camp gay men in them, and so they kind of picked it up from those men. So they weren't kind of the owners of the language. I have less evidence to show that women used it in that kind of reversal way, so referring to themselves with male names and male pronouns. There was a documentary series in the early 90s called Summers Out on Channel 4, which had a kind of an episode on gay social history, and they had some clips which they recreated of people on the London double-decker bus speaking Polari. And one of those clips was of two women who were calling each other by male names and kind of doing the gender switching. Now, it was a made-up clip, but they got the lines from actual people who'd spoken it, who kind of helped them with it. So there is some evidence that women did that, but I might be able to come across very authentic uses of that.
Going on to the more formal aspects of it, a couple of questions have been put about Polari grammar, because it seems to be more than just word substitution and has its own grammatical structure, doesn't it?
Some of the speakers who used it, as I was saying earlier, did use it in a way where I was starting to see evidence that there was something interesting going on with grammar. And it's kind of a reductive form of grammar, maybe, where things are taken out and you've got to infer things by context. I'll try and think of an example, maybe, to illustrate that. So a sentence like palone, vada, palone, very cod, which word for word would translate to woman looks gay man very bad, which doesn't mean much, but used in a context where you'd be in a cafe with somebody and there'd be a woman sitting nearby and she'd be sort of looking over at you and sort of pulling a face, and so you'd say palone vada, palone very cod. What you're saying is that woman over there is giving me dirty looks. So that there's something interesting happening there with the grammar, so you don't get that word for word gloss, which you can do an easy translation to it. The talking about yourself in third person. So woman looks gay man, woman is looking at me, and you're using only palone, gay man, to refer to yourself, for example, which is not something that we do in English, not standard English anyway.
No, but if you took something, I mean, Chris Wallace points out to, by way of comparison, it's more like pidgin or creole, that you would have a language that is just more than just word substitution, but has its own vocabulary and its own syntax.
Yeah, so a pidgin is kind of a simplified form of a language. And Creole's where you get two languages kind of combined together and simplified, and then they start to kind of get their own structure, and they sort of take off. So they're kind of approaching a language maybe more than a pidgin. So I think, yes, you could say that there's an argument. I remember doing this back with my PhD, kind of going through all of these different kind of categories of language to say, is Polari a pidgin, is it a Creole? Because Polari has so many different influences to it, I don't think you can just take a couple and say, it's a Creole in the way that most Creoles were just, one, two or three. It's a very much of a magpie language coming, with loads of different sources. And also, people used it in different ways. There's not just one Polari, there's lots of different versions of it, I think, or slightly different versions, depending on the friendship groups, the part of the country of the UK you're at. People, because it wasn't written down, it was spoken in secret, people ad-libbed it, they added their own words and phrases into it and their own nuances to it. So you get these different versions of it, depending where you are in the country and what time period you're at, and who you're speaking to. So it does make it complicated.
One further question developing this is the adaptation of grammar in some groups likely to have been a conscious response to the degree of mutual intelligibility that you mentioned earlier, for example, with languages like Italian, or was it just a natural evolution that was adapted through use?
Possibly a bit of both, I'd say, which is always the easy way out when you have a question like this. Yeah, I mean, I think they wanted to make it as difficult to understand as possible, even amongst other gay people. So they really tried, and people have talked about a West End version of it, which was very simple, more like the Julian and Sandy version, and then the East End version, which was more based around the docks and the pubs that were based around the docks, and the Yiddish community, Jewish community, sorry, that spoke Yiddish, and the Sea people, and which was much more complex. And they had a version of Polari called HPRly, where they would sort of take the normal Polari words and phrases and they'd add arly into them. So rather than saying something like vada the lallies, which means look at the legs, they'd say something like viarly viliaris, which just adds that slightly more complicated, kind of twist to it. And that was to kind of confuse other gay men. So it wasn't that they were trying to reach out to everybody in a kind of happy alliance. They were literally trying to confuse other gay people that they wanted to talk about as well, and also put one over. So yeah, I think there was a sense of making it as complicated as possible. The sense of a natural evolution, yeah, I think so too. I think particularly because for most people there was quite a limited vocabulary of it, and you had to make those words work pretty hard. One thing that a lot of Polari speakers did was that they'd combine words together to make new ones. So words like the word multi, which means a lot of, or great, or big. You'd combine it with another word to make a completely new concept. So an omi is a man, a multi-omi would be a king, a great man, things like that. So there's definitely something going on with that, I think, and that feels more like a kind of evolved thing where they've got what they have and they're really making it work.
Do you think that something like RuPaul is a development of having that kind of language in the shows that he produces and the language that he employs?
I think so, yes. I think there are some links. I mean, I said earlier that we're taking our lead from America, but there are some some sort of Britishisms in RuPaul's Drag Race. A nice one is zhoosh, which is quite an old Polari word. One of my favourite Polari words because it starts with a kind of consonant that is very rarely appears as a consonant at the beginning of British English words. You find it more in French. So in zhoosh, in Drag Race, you can zhoosh your hair or zhoosh your outfit or something to make it more glamorous or better. In Polari, you zhoosh your hair too, and a hairdresser was a riah zhoosher, literally hair zhoosher. But you could also zhoosh someone's handbag, which was steal their money, or you could zhoosh them a drink down, zhoosh the pani down your throat. So it had multiple meanings, the zhoosh. Yeah, so I think that was a bit of a diversion. But yes, I think RuPaul's Drag Race definitely has links, you know, linguistically and in terms of the kind of the camp attitude. I think to the older kind of Polari speakers. But you know, that was going on in America at the same time as the UK as well.
Well, I remember particularly he talks about using your charisma, uniqueness, nerve, and talent, which has a particular meaning.
An acronym, yes, yeah, to get it, yeah. There, and you know, Polari was full of these acronyms as well. One of my favourites is TBH, which meant to be had. And so, you know, if you went into a bar and you go, oh, he's TBH, you know, and it either meant, you know, to be had as in like he was gay, or he was very attractive and you wanted to have him. And so no prizes for guessing what NTBH is, not to be had. So you know, so that would be somebody who wasn't very attractive or was probably straight and not worth trying.
Now, unless anybody has any further questions, any more? I feel like I'm doing an auction. Thank you very, very much indeed, Paul. It's been a great evening, and I'm sure that I speak for everybody when I say that we have really, really enjoyed it. Come again.
Thank you very much. It's been bona, and thank you for your very highbrow questions. I think they're the best questions I've had one of these kinds of talks. So I'm very impressed with you all.
Well, if you look at the chat, you're getting absolutely bouquets galore. All right. Good night, everybody. Bye.
Good night. Thank you for listening.